Social Development Studies of Chulalongkorn Universities. I am pleased to offer some brief welcome remarks to this public seminar on Towards a Green and Just Recovery in Southeast Asia, Climate Futures, Sustainable Transformations, and the Role of China. I would like to warmly welcome all participants to today's event taking place in the Faculty of Political Science. After a period of many online meetings, it is a pleasure to see events such as this return to being in person, while also connecting to the online community in a hybrid format. I would like to express my appreciation to the China Dialogue team for co-organizing this public seminar together with the Center for Social Development Studies. This is a very meaningful collaboration, and I hope that it can continue beyond the current event. The overarching theme of this public seminar is an important one. In recent years, multiple intersecting crises have affected people's lives in mainland Southeast Asia, including global economic crisis and geopolitical tensions, the COVID pandemic, widespread ecological damage and biodiversity loss, and climate-connected disasters. In response, calls for a green and just recovery have grown, although its policy formulation is not clear or agreed upon. This public seminar is bringing together scholars, journalists, and civil society to ask what a green and just recovery could look like in the region, who gets to define the vision and how it can be achieved. The speakers will take climate change, rivers, and energy as entry points to explore the wider socio-political opportunities and challenges involved toward achieving sustainable transformations. The seminar takes place in the context of recently concluded COP27 climate talks and a range of other agendas influencing the debate. For example, China's vision for a green belt and road, the UN guiding principle on business and human rights, and the civil society-led agendas such as on the commons and rights of nature. Through the interactions today, I hope that a clearer sense of both the challenge and promising ways forward will emerge. The Faculty of Political Science is very honored to host this important public seminar, and I would like to wish you an engaging discussion today. Thank you for your kind attention. Welcome to faculty. ขอบคุณครับ ขอบคุณครับ I hope you have a fruitful discussion. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Dean Prakon. ขอบคุณมากครับ
ขอบคุณครับ
So I think with this, we can begin the first panel. So please, can I invite Kevin Woods, who will be the moderator for this morning. Kevin is a fellow with the East-West Center based in Hawaii.
Is that better? Good morning, everyone. What an honor to moderate the first panel this morning. Thanks for the organizers for inviting me. We have three exciting, insightful panelists this morning to start off the day. I will be introducing them now, and then we'll have them give their remarks, and then we can open up for discussion before our coffee break. So let me first introduce Dr. Wei Shun. Maybe, do you want them? Okay, Dr. Wei Shun, please join us up here. Dr. Wei Shun is a political economist who has over 2 decades of experience in South-South cooperation and development finance. He's at the very well-known and respected Institute for Development Studies at the University of Sussex in England. His research interest is focused on low carbon development and the energy transition in China and its impact on international development. He's working on issues around social economic impacts of a low carbon just transition in promoting green industries in China. And I think we'll agree this is not only a paramount issue of great import to China, but also the world's ability to minimize climate catastrophe. He is also a lead author of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I'm sure we're all well versed about. His responsibility was for reviewing the mitigation policies and institutions in the global south. So Wei Shun, thank you for joining us. And then going forward, start with your remarks. Then we have Shimali Uttal, who oh, I was not aware it went off. I'm sorry. Shimali is the executive director. Yeah, why not? I'll move over. Okay. Shimali is the executive director of Focus on the Global South, an NGO that I actually have known, as well as Shimali, since I think literally the first year I have started working on environmental rights in Southeast Asia. So it's wonderful to see her after all these years. She has been working on trade, investment, debt, the commons, land resource rights, and food sovereignty, all this good stuff we love, for over 3 decades now, with emphasis on community and women's rights and democratization of governance. Her work includes research, writing, campaigning, and popular education on issues related to economic, social, and ecological justice. She works with grassroots movements on the creation and governance of natural, social, and knowledge commons, strengthening food sovereignty and public goods and services. So Shimali, thank you so much. And I don't believe our third panelist is here yet. I'll hold off on the introduction, but Ajahn Surichai Wunkao will be joining us shortly. And once he arrives, I will be honored to introduce him as well. So Shimali, do you want to come up? I'll scoot over. And then we'll start with Dr. Wei Shun for starting us off.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for the introduction. And it's my great pleasure to be here and to talk about the recent development in China regarding China's policy initiatives around the Green BRI and what are the new development, or whether there's any new development after these new policy initiatives are announced, and what could be the impacts of energy transition in the region that we're looking at today. So yeah, excuse me, maybe I should bring my laptop here because I can't see the screen. Sorry about this. For the researchers who've been working on South-South cooperation, and particularly China's overseas impacts in the energy sector, it could be a very exciting year because since the launch of the policy initiatives since 2017, previously by the Ministry of Environment and Ecology, it has been quiet for several years until last year, that there are very intensive policy announcements from different ministries in China. As you can see, that the newly established Chinese aid agency called CIDCA, China International Development Cooperation Agency, first announced its foreign aid white paper, and for the first time to talk about the link of Chinese aid with SDGs and so on. So this is the first time that China tried to, at least its foreign development or foreign aid agency, trying to deviate from previous quite mercantilist approach of Chinese foreign loans into very different types of narratives that supporting sustainability and SDGs and so on. But then in the July, it is the first time, as you can see, that not only Ministry of Ecology and Environment joined these kind of narrative changes, but also it allies with the MOFCOM, the Ministry of Commerce, to issue joint guidelines for a green development agenda for overseas investment. Again, MOFCOM is a kind of a very traditionally very powerful ministry that overseeing all the foreign loans and foreign lending activities. So this is the first time that we see the marriage of these two institutions, two ministries that announced this green policy or green agenda. And then it is, of course, Xi Jinping's announcement of stop co-financing in September, and then October, just 1 month later, National Energy Administration, a regulator that specifically focusing on energy sector, also issued a kind of a so-called Qingdao proposal on green energy transition in overseas markets. And then in March this year, you see NDRC, the national, another very powerful economic regulator, joining with MEE and the MOFCOM, and this time with Ministry of Foreign Affairs also, to have this kind of new green lines on green BRI. So all these policy announcements made it very clear this is not a fad, this is not a kind of show business, this is a kind of a sincere transformation, at least at the central level for these policy changes. But what they are actually arguing for behind these mainstream narrative changes, I think two major things. First, they realize that the previous decade of BRI activities has some problems. They didn't say it clearly or openly, but they realized that previous activities are in somehow unsustainable, and some of the practices within these projects are actually incompatible with SDGs. And also they understand that such kind of incompatibilities with the SDGs could bring reputational and political and commercial risks. That's why all the ministries actually are joining these kind of narrative changes. So what they really want actually are two things. First, they try to develop more green, so-called greener infrastructure projects in their portfolio. That's one objective. The other objective is that they try to, at least some of these ministries, probably not all of them, some of ministries trying to promoting a kind of a more strict, greener kind of standards for environmental and social impact assessment. So that's kind of a two objectives they're trying to promoting. And also in Xi Jinping's talk, I think on the third BRI forum, he specifically said we want to do smaller projects. We want to do smaller projects compared to the large infrastructure projects in the previous decade, the so-called small and beautiful projects. And also in the policy documents, the first time they try to emphasize these kind of multiple links, multiple networks that go beyond the kind of state to state, this kind of networks. They're trying to say, well, we need to develop this net connection. So I think most of the problems we've been talking about BRI seems that be heard, at least by the central government at the moment. That's my impression. And they seems to understand that there are lack of kind of connections with civil societies, with local business. There are lack of emphasis on smaller projects that really have social impacts and so on. But the question is that why they would like to make a change in this particular time. I think there are several reasons because, sorry, I didn't. It's not working. Okay. This time. So from this slide, as you can see that the red arrow on the top right corner, that since 2018, actually since 2017, in some areas, in some geographic areas, the Chinese lending is dropping significantly. And since 2018, seems that all the areas, the lending from China is dropping significantly. There are several reasons for that. Of course, one is the economic cycle that many countries are in the default, are in the repayment difficulties. And the other is that the pandemic really hit hard, that some of the projects really need to be stopped. And there are geopolitical struggles that China is really kind of concerned. Some of the investment in some areas will be interfered by or affected by these geopolitical struggles. But in the energy sector, there are sectoral related issues. For example, the renewable energy become cheaper and cheaper. As I said, the first objective for them is to promote greener projects, because greener projects have become economically more and more viable, and changing the energy endowment, that is the first incentive for them to make a change. But the other factor is that most of the renewable energy projects are actually through the IPP model, really, rather than the state sponsored model, that really drive them to make a change. Because as I'll explain later on, that the previous model that they are using for their finance, for their business model, may not be very suitable for the renewables. And that's why, under this context, that the central government, at least the ministries, are trying to make some change. But there are also kind of industrial factors as well. I'm sorry, I need to focus on two computers. This is one quote. I just did a field study this summer with some of the Development Finance Institute. And over competition among the Chinese companies is another reason for them to make a change. Because, as I said, because of the fast drop of the Chinese lending, so nowadays the competition is even more intense. That if you have a high quality, so-called good projects in a good country, everybody is like running like a rabbit. And even under the Power China umbrella, there will be dozens of companies competing for one project. And think about, there are different SOE groups. Besides Power China, there are Energy China, Three Gorges, and Sinomac, and all these groups, they have at least 40 or 50 companies trying to compete with each other. So we call this in Chinese called Neijuan, means kind of a very ineffective competition among Chinese companies that really affected the how to say, the whole situation. And it also affects the way they look at the environmental and social benefits. If you look at the situation, because one of the results of this over competition is that the price will be very low, and the time frame will be very straight. So any minor delay of the project is a big issue for them, and they don't have any flexibilities to, for example, if you want a new school, if you want to spend 1%, say, I said in many IPPs that you need to spend 1% on social projects and so on. They don't have that kind of money because the competition is so high. The price is already very low. The profit margin for them is very low. So that changes everything, I think. But how these policy changes I mentioned affects the existing governance structure. This is the existing one that you see that the governing structure is mainly including 4 ministries. I mentioned 3 of them: Minister of Commerce, MOFCOM, NDRC, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, MOFA. But it seems that at the moment, Minister of Finance is not included, or maybe they're not keen, maybe they think they are irrelevant because this isn't really kind of a monetary ministry. But at the moment, Minister of Finance is not involved in any green BRI policies. And also the guidelines that we see in the first slide are not actually changing the project approval process, which means that, for example, all the environmental and social impact assessment will still go through MOFCOM and Ministry of Finance rather than to MEE. Ministry of Environment and Ecology. Even if the guideline was issued by MEE, MEE don't have project screening authority on the ground. So that's why all these guidelines are not really fundamentally changing the existing governance system. That's my argument. But so it's trying very hard to change the situation because this is the most kind of active ministry trying to change the picture. So they launched several reports. This is one of them to strengthening the environmental and social impact assessment. And it's called traffic light system, which are led by a group of think tanks under the MEE. So this is a think tank report, but the major funder actually is or supporter is the MEE. So under this traffic system, as you can see in the energy sector, coal power is all red. So all the red projects are those who should not be allowed to approved. And the yellow projects are allowed to be approved on a case-by-case study, case-by-case basis, and the green projects can be automatically approved as long as the economic viables are okay. So that's the design of this traffic light system. So as you can see, at least based on this report supported by MEE, coal and hydro are in red line, under the red line, and the gas projects are in the yellow line, and all the non-hydro renewables are actually automatically green projects. Then that leads to another issue, is because this report is only about environmental impacts. It's not about social impacts. So if you have automatically green lights for any solar and large wind projects, the social impacts could also be a consideration, but that's not supported by MEE at the moment. This is the recent report. But regarding the new projects, from 2020, I mean, since the announcement of stop financing coal, actually even before that, the proportion of fossil fuel projects has been decreasing, and the portfolio of renewables are actually increasing. And based on our field study this year, there will be no coal projects, and particularly among SOEs. For the SOEs, state-owned enterprises, coal is kind of a red line here. It's like they will not touch it. But there will be some of the private companies who would like to take up the remaining or the kind of contracted coal projects. I think there is one in Laos, and there is someone in Africa as well. And some private Chinese companies would like to take the chance. But when SOEs are actually quitting, that's for coal. And for wind and solar, actually, they are taking up much larger share to over 45–46% of total renewables nowadays. So the number of wind and solar are actually really increasing, and particularly in some countries like Vietnam. That's another change, not change, but that's another interesting issue, is that Chinese investment, actually not investment, because Chinese projects are mainly EPC projects, which means that they construct the projects, they transfer it to government utilities or government agencies under this kind of EPC plus finance model. But as I said, all the renewables are more or less like IPPs. They're not government projects anymore. So which means that now the Chinese construction companies, these big SOEs, Power China, Energy China, whatever you name it, need to find the private companies to work with if they don't want to be a project developers at the same time, right? That changed the whole situation, because you need to have a business partner this time, not a government partner anymore. right, to develop these projects. That becomes a very big obstacle for some markets for the Chinese companies. So this kind of a dominant EPC plus finance model need to be changed. But how to change that is still debated among Chinese companies and Chinese financial institutions. The last thing, I'm probably taking too long time. Other slides is about the debt. If you think about the strategy or cooperative strategy of China Exim Bank, Sino-Shore, and China Development Bank, they are much more conservative nowadays regarding their lending strategies. They are more conservative even compared to some commercial lenders, particularly because of this kind of debt issues of many countries, particularly in Africa, but there are one or two, I think, in this region that are still kind of become a concern, Laos, and probably to some extent Myanmar, that affects the lending decisions of China Exim Bank and China Development Bank nowadays. And particularly the export credit insurance companies, they are less keen to insure any sovereign risks from these countries, mostly. So I will just sum up. So first, the green BRI ideologies are mainstreamed among Chinese central ministries to not replace the mercantilist approach, but at least complement the mercantilist approach that dominated the previous decade. And there are new policy actors coming in, Ministry of Environment and Ecology in particular, but National Energy Administration as well, and Ministry of Technology and Information Technology and so on. There are line ministries that are trying to engage with overseas sector to kind of destabilizing the kind of existing governance system. And some of these new ministries are more open to civil society engagement compared to the traditional ones. If you think about the report made by, I mentioned the traffic light system, they are mainly done by the Chinese and international NGOs actually supporting MEEs. So renewable energy activities are rising, but they are focusing particularly on some countries. How to say, the Chinese investment is very polarized because in some markets they're very active, but in some markets they are just, they just don't touch it, mainly because of the lending strategies I mentioned about Chinese DFIs. And the larger projects like, multi-billion US dollars that we've seen in the last decades will be very less and less frequent. Reforms are needed among Chinese banks and SOEs. For the SOEs, they need to try project development rather just a EPC contractor. For the DFIs, they need to be more flexible and innovative for supporting IPPs. But how to make this happen is yet to know. As I said, just the transition is a problem because we can't take it for granted that as long as it's wind, as long as it's solar, it will be a just project. There will be land-related issues and so on, which are not yet considered by the Chinese regulators and DFIs at the moment. I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wei Shen. I think it's a wonderful demonstration of the insight that a political economist can provide on analyzing a just green transition versus other disciplines. So I really appreciate that insight that you was able to provide. Question for the organizers. Are we going to do all questions at the end, or do we take a few questions before moving on to the next speaker?
Maybe at the end, I think, yeah.
that keep happening? I'm so sorry. He has wide-ranging research interests that include the sociology of development, environmentalism, and sustainable development, as well as social movements, among many others. Ajahn Shurichai is also concurrently advisor and chairperson to many prestigious national Thai commissions and committees on peace, reconciliation, and civil society movements on labor, democracy, and the environment. In his free time, Ajahn also publishes many books and articles. For these many achievements and accolades, several years ago, he was recognized as the country's most distinguished sociologist. So what an honor to have Ajahn Shurichai join us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I am honored to be here. Would you allow me to speak, to be the last speaker on the panel, so that I get a little more familiarized? I would appreciate Kevin. Yes.
Permission.
Okay, all right. Sorry. Oops. Yeah. Is that okay? All right. Okay, so I'm Shalmali. I've already been introduced by Kevin, so I won't say any more. Just good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. I don't have a PowerPoint. All these years, I've never learned to make a good PowerPoint, but I'll try to make some powerful points instead. Let's see if that works, you know. Now, I want to share some thoughts with you about green transition in the area of food systems, particularly. We are in the midst of an unfolding global food crisis and an imminent recession. And in the broader context of accelerating climate change, increasing inequality, continuing wars, conflicts and occupations, and deepening authoritarianism. And, you know, all these are elements of multiple intersecting stressors, you know, that are creating cascades of impacts. The new buzzword seems to be polycrisis, although most of us who are working in the field of political ecology and political economy, and know that this has been going on for a long time. So you have buzzwords, but the actual reality of what's been happening has been happening for a long time now. And at Focus, we've been monitoring how the current food crisis is playing out in South and Southeast Asia. And we've just released a collection of articles titled The Global Food Crisis This Time. You'll find it on our website and Focus on the Global South. Now, in my view, green transition is simply not possible without radical structuring of the global food system. And I think we are in the middle of, in the middle of numerous other trends that are happening. There is a war that has been waged by the global food system on local, diverse, territorially embedded economic and food systems. I won't go into, I don't know if I have the time to go into all the details of that war, but I'll try and present some elements of that. Now, just before I move into the main points, a few words about the recently concluded Conference of Parties, the COP27, that was held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, because that's part of our discussion or the context setting for this meeting. Now, I think it's important to keep in mind that many of the world's largest corporations that have significant environmental, carbon, social footprints and political footprints, given that many of them prop up extreme authoritarian regimes. They were there in full show. Much of the climate justice movement that was in Egypt did not put on the table demands for the release of political prisoners, prisoners of conscience, which in the 21st century is a shocking crime, that somebody would be jailed and tortured just because they think differently. And my own country, India, climate justice activists are hounded. Food sovereignty activists are hounded. Right to information activists are hounded. And I'm not talking, just in case anybody might think of the term activist in sort of an old world way of people wearing, homespun like a Ajahn Shurichai, carrying banners. No, we're talking about journalists, we're talking about academics, we're even talking about policymakers, and even talking elected parliamentarians. They are hounded by the state for offering or for challenging or for questioning development models, infrastructure programs, agricultural policies, energy investment and energy policies. So asking about what their impacts will be on social and environmental issues. They're called anti-national, they're called dissidents, enemies of the state, and so on. And this is, this is not just happening in India. This is happening across the world. And we had just had a conference of parties in a country where many have been jailed, and this issue was not raised at all. So how do you have a green transition? How do you move from a destructive economic, infrastructure-oriented investment and trade system to something that is just and sustainable when the freedom, when freedom of speech and right to information, et cetera, are being blatantly violated all the time. So I want to put that on the table. And COP27 was criticized by a number of people who were there and by a number of commentators as a trade show. There were more than 100 fossil fuel lobbyists in the list of attendees. More than 20, and this is 25% more than were there in Glasgow last year. There were at least 636 fossil fuel lobbyists affiliated with the world's biggest polluting oil and gas giants, Shell, Chevron, BP, and so on. And, but this is the nature of COPs. COP17 in Durban in 2011 was dubbed the Conference of Polluters rather than the Conference of Parties, because of the sponsorship by mining companies of the talks. Coca-Cola was one of the biggest sponsors, of this COP. And if you, going back to those of you who read the Kyoto Protocol more than 2 decades ago, that read much more as like a trade agreement than like than a collection of multilateral commitments to actually tackle climate change. A lot of it was about undermining common and differentiated treaty, the CBDR principle that is supposed to make multilateral commitments, not for compensation, but for reparations. For reparations for the destruction that's been caused historically through the Industrial Revolution and colonialism and colonial extraction. But the Kyoto Protocol already undermined that. And then you come to Paris, the Paris Agreement, which was nothing. If the Paris Agreement was the standard to aspire to for a green transition, it's a very low standard indeed. Now, of course, one of the victories or gains from COP27 was the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, finally, which has been in debate for several years. And this, I think, the G77, led by China and Pakistan, and the Egyptian presidency supported G77 this time, put up a good fight this time. And I suppose, wealthy countries led by the United States could no longer block the Loss and Damage Fund because of what happened in Pakistan. And, the optics were really shocking and the reality was absolutely shocking. But let's also remember that, just in the past year, the big 5 oil companies, Chevron, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Total Energies, have made over $170 billion of just profit. This is just profit in the last 12 months. And that's more money every day than the sum committed so far to loss and damage by rich countries. What the rich countries have committed to for loss and damage is only $272 million. And the profit made is, think about how much more that is, And this is research done by Global Justice Now, whose numbers are very rigorous. So, if you apply that, that share of estimated cost to what's happening with climate chaos in the global south, these companies should be responsible for an $8 trillion climate bill. And that money is nowhere in sight. And again, Global Justice Now has done some very rigorous numbers analysis in terms of ascribing responsibility to who's, to climate change. Now, coming to the food and green transition issue, if we look at the 2021 report of SOFI, the State of Food Insecurity and Nutrition in the World, that was released last year, that showed that over the last 5 years, hunger, this is 5 years from 2020, hunger has been rising. Hunger, food insecurity, malnutrition have been rising at an alarming rate. And this is pre-COVID. Yes, COVID added to the numbers, but this is pre-COVID. This is from the last recession and from the last financial crisis of 2009, 2008 to 2010, after which there was a recession and so on and so forth. No? And just in 2020, that's last year, 811 million people faced hunger, which was an increase of 160 million people compared to 2019. But the more important thing was that this increase was equal more than that of the previous 5 years combined. So in a single year, nearly 1 in 3 people in a world of 2.37 billion did not have access to adequate food. And this was last year. And according this year, world hunger has again risen. And, now I think the new number that they're saying is that 150 million more people face hunger. And, the number of people who can't afford a healthy diet at all has increased by 112 million to almost 3.1 billion in this world. Now, this amount could be much greater if you take into account job losses. And the issue of looking at healthy diets and hunger is important because there are a number of governments, including my own, that insist that there is no hunger in India. India, tanks literally in global hunger, but they insist there's no hunger, that the problem is malnutrition. And the problem of malnutrition can then be addressed by food fortification, not by food, but by food products. And, when we're thinking about green transition, all these matter because who is making those food products? And what is the carbon footprint? And what is the economic, social, political footprint of these food products that are being created? Now, the effects of inflation, of course, in consumer food prices, stemming from the economic impacts of COVID-19 and all the measures to put in place to contain the pandemic, have increased costs and worsened, of course, the unaffordability of healthy diets. And between 2019 and 2020, Asia witnessed the highest surge in the cost of a healthy diet, 4%, followed by Oceania. Interestingly, Africa, which is considered the hungry continent, the cost of that surge in the cost of a healthy diet, Africa had the lowest. It was 2.5%, whereas in Asia, it was the highest, which is 4% across the world. And a number of analysts are assessing that a big reason for this is because there has been a systematic shift in meeting food needs from local small-scale production and local territorially embedded food systems to supermarketization and an expanding global food system. And this is the reason why I say that a green transition is simply not possible unless we restructure this global food system. How much more time do I have, Kevin? Because I can just keep rambling on. 5 more minutes? Yikes. Sorry. Okay.
I want to make sure we have time for discussion.
Right. Yeah, I understand. Right? Now, many governments and most governments, actually, multilateral and international agencies are by and large, apportioning the lion's share of blame for the global food crisis to, of course, global food shortages arising from the war in Ukraine, pandemic, climate change. All these are important, very much important. But what they're ignoring are important structural flaws in the global food system, which include global value chains, the increasing dependence of global food systems on value chains, multi-level and cross-sectoral market concentration and financialization, and increasing food commodity speculation. Now these are, 3 or 4 trends that have actually been enabled by policy responses rather than been disciplined. And they have made the global food system and increasingly national food systems increasingly susceptible to food crisis. And, although wheat futures did shoot up, the prices after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February this year, food price volatility was already rampant well before that. And food prices had reached record levels, in the past few years. And this is from, the FAO, the Food Price Index Watch. Now, there's an abundance of evidence to show that policy responses to past food crises have enabled the rise of sort of a financialized global industrial food system. This functions through very complex value chains, through a sort of corporate-dominated global trade and unregulated commodity future markets. It has a high ecological footprint, climate footprint, social political footprint, and the political footprint is extremely important because farmers, peasants, agricultural workers, migrant workers who stand up for their rights are dealt with extremely harshly. I was told, because I haven't been here for 2 years, I shifted back to India. I was told that I can't even say the name of some corporations on the Chula campus, because otherwise Chula can be slapped with a slap case. That's how far the gag rule has gone. That's how far the protection of corporations has gone. So it's okay to lock up peasants and fishers who are fighting to, protect their lands and protect their food system, to protect their rice. But it's not okay to say, to question the policy, the national policies that are supported by certain agri-food corporations. And three trends here, which have been, this is my last point, I promise. Three trends here, which I think need to be looked at very closely in the context of green transition. One is the growing trend of global supply chains. Because with 2000 and, with the food price crisis that happened in 2007 to 2009, that should have triggered a serious review of global supply chains and, a disciplining of global supply chains, but it didn't. Instead, global food supply chains became longer and longer. And in, research done recently shows that from then to now, the global agricultural trade more than tripled in value, and chains became longer and longer. And some 20% of the calories that people eat, 20% of the world's calories, such as rice, soya, grains, wheat, cross at least one international border. And more important, they have from 1980 to 2017 or 18, the expansion of global value chains and internationally traded food to meet basic food needs has gone up by more than 50%. And 1/3 now of the world's food is coming from low and middle income countries. It's still being traded by global corporations, but it's coming from low and middle income countries. But the gains from those agricultural trade that are promoted by value chains are captured by foreign investors, agribusiness corporations, and with almost no benefit to smallholder food producers, nor to even domestic economies. Domestic economies continue to be strapped in the South, in the global South, especially in low-income countries, with large debts, food import bills, and dependence on, speculative markets that they have absolutely no political power in economic governance systems to control. And then, of course, COVID-19 has shown the complete disasters and dependence of the global value chain supply systems on, especially on exploited migrant workers. The other trend that needs to be really tackled is the issue of corporate concentration. The historical examination of food crisis over the past 50 years by a well-known political economist and food systems analyst in Canada shows that the global industrial food system has been rendered more to price volatility because of three types of concentration. Concentration at the farm and field level, at the national distribution level, and at the global agricultural markets level. So there is an increasing reliance in the global industrial food system on a small number of staple grains that are being produced using highly industrialized farm methods, which again makes the system more susceptible to events that affect just a handful of crops and to the rising crops of industrial farm inputs, which we have seen has happened, with the war in Ukraine, with increasing price of fossil fuels, etc. Then a small number of countries specialize in the production of staple grains for export. Many other countries depend on these, including some of the poorest and most food insecure countries. And again, we see what happens with war, climate change, and so on when these supply chains are disrupted. And finally, the global grain trade is dominated by a small number of firms in highly financialized commodity markets that are very prone to volatility. And these are all figures that are coming from official multilateral sources like the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNCTAD, the World Food Programme, and so on. And so I'll stop here, but to not leave my presentation in a gloom and doom mode. What's the way forward? Well, the way forward has been shown by Asia's small-scale food producers. We are having this meeting in Thailand, which has such a diversity of local food systems. The entire Mekong region has such a local diversity of food systems. But look what's happening in Myanmar. Actually, Kevin knows Myanmar very well, and we have our friend from Myanmar here. Look what's happening there. What's happening to local food producers and the entire population? What's happened in Cambodia and Laos? Laos was the world's second largest contributor to rice biodiversity. That small country. Where is that rice biodiversity? They had 13,000 varieties and counting. All of them were not even fully accounted for. India is still considered the largest contributor to agro biodiversity in rice. Although, of course, there will be geopolitics between India and Pakistan, right? Where does basmati come from, etc. But that aside, the point is that the countries in Asia, which is primarily which are classified by governments, barring Singapore, and multilateral research agencies as primarily agrarian economies, they have some of the most diverse food systems that come not only from farming, but also from fishing, from gathering, from livestock, and so on. And this is where I think, in my view, the solution lies, the way forward lies. But in order for these local food systems to thrive and to survive, it needs tremendous amount of policy support from governments, public policy support, and also political and social support from all of us. Because these small-scale food producers and the agricultural workers are under political threat of, I've already talked about what's happening. So why don't I end here? Sorry to take so much.
Thank you. Well done. From the stuffy hallways of COP27 to the food and agricultural systems that you discussed, to the importance of human rights and political freedoms in moving the world towards green and just transition. That was really well spoken. And I especially appreciated the food and agricultural systems, because oftentimes I think that's left out when we're talking about a just green transition. So thank you very much, Somali. Again, keep your questions until the end. We have one more speaker who I introduced previously, John Shurichai. We would love to hear from you for about 15 minutes or so, and then we can have 15 to 20 minutes discussion before our coffee break. Thank you.
Thank you. I am not sure whether we can be very hopeful about the future or not, but we are here to hope. The hope demands self-examination, reflection, as well as collaboration. I am speaking in the light of increasing inequalities, increasing inhuman human practices among human societies toward their own society as well as to others. There are unbelievable things that I don't want to go into, too dark, but yet we want to talk about the green recovery, just recovery. How can we maintain our sense of moving ahead? Demands trust, demands self-reflection, demands new efforts going beyond just buzzwords and all these things. I am speaking as I'm a bit old here, but also as a part of a university, which is supposed to be an actor in the world where we talk a lot about, I was happy to see your word, policy sectors. Who owns the policy sectors? Who owns it? And I was too late to listen to the whole presentation. Policy sector needs many things, but a few things beyond national governments. Sure. But without the victimized sectors, it has no legitimation. So in the word of, highlighted, no one left behind. The Chinese Communist Party, whatever party, also are challenged into this area of legitimation. Now, let me say, come back to what I should be presenting. First, recovery from what? Just recovery, or green recovery. In fact, it's not just black, white, but we are talking about recovery while we are still in a even worsening situation. I don't have to re-emphasize the presentation, but there are a lot of hopes. I mean, like the graphics that I saw from you, there are certain way of promise appeared on the paper. That would mean, how can we move as a next step of accountability system in the world beyond just, narrowing our game for blame politics. I sure people who are responsible should be blamed. Yes, but I am asking myself, how can we, in this kind of very conflictual, very trust diminishing, even worsen impact after good promise 2015, now with several things happening, Mr. Biden is clear in his articulation that China is the enemy. The language has changed from those of just a few years. That is not quite, I am not saying that he has no right to say so, but my point is that the climate of policy making in the world are much affected by the keywords of the kind that we are creating for how policy sector in the world could be more accountable, could be more responsible to the worsening life well-being of many people, of the whole system itself. But the core issue about biodiversity have only here and there coming up, but not so well integrated, even in the university engagement with our future. So much about red light endangered species, but so little relating to how we frame the whole deep interrelated systems of our life, or so much to life system support system from the biodiversity and the earth. So my point here is that the just and green recovery is a meaningful promise and a hopeful one. Why we must be warned and we must have a very inclusive approach to it, while the whole politics of framing have become very dangerous even for some people. So the responsibility of a forum like this would relate to how the framing of this, how could we move ahead in the way that it would be inclusive enough to include the victims and also the affected sectors. And I was happy, I was kind of relieved to see that new actors in policy sectors in China moving a bit opening up, but that's very challenging still. But it's more than welcome. For in many countries, which supposed to be democratic, we have already faced the reality that articulated by colleagues. So I think the rights, the human as the supreme right owner, stakeholder of the right regime itself also have been challenged. I am much interested to see how the human could be more engaged in our discussion with the sense of caring for other lives who should also have rights. Other systems that would open up for our age, 1,000-old wisdom from all religions that make us feel human should be still humble in the light of all this. Now we call it climate, precarity, whatever, but all done in the complex processes, long-term processes, and resulted in a very unpredictable and uncontrollable disasters, and added with our political framing of the disasters itself. So I would like now just to say the context of, please allow me, there are a lot of issues, but I think the politics of framing is now in the risk of, in the world of legitimation crisis, including what happens to the global policy sectoral discussion. So all this need to be engaged, and all this needs to be challenged. And so the issue is not only about the right to dissent alone, but the issue is how to create healthy policy ecology for us to discuss beyond you as a Chinese, I as a Thai, the other one as the enemy of the whatever, the state. The ladies in Iran, in Tehran, have become the enemy of the state. So all this kind of framing, it has become so real, so close to many people, but in some way very distant. But we are warned that with this geographical distance, we are faced with even more intellectual responsibility, how we, beyond just ordinary political issue, how we frame it together to create more enabling environment where we can move ahead a bit, new steps, to be more responsible to very helpless situation in many contexts, even like in our country or nearby countries. Many people profit a lot from war. I don't have to say in what country or in what company. Ukraine is a very profitable place. I don't have to mention neighboring countries, which are much more in the very complicated but very clearly civil war situation like in Myanmar. And Thailand also is a part of how we should move, not Thailand not alone, but need to really be seeing itself as a more multi-level engagement possibility. So I am speaking from a retired person, but at the university, but still feel that the reason why we are here is that the responsibility of knowledge demands that we all face with a very difficult world, even increasingly difficult in terms of policy sectors, in terms of public knowledge. Because public knowledge often have become captured in certain national or certain social belongings, social, certain ethnic or religious framing of knowledge. So here, if you allow me to just come to my final point, I really feel that the policy ecology for the future is one of the core responsibility for us to engage beyond the usual state-centric or country-centric specific framing of the responsibility. That those are important, seriously important in many cases. But I would like to start by hoping that because of the diversity of our audience here, I feel many people still profit a lot in this. Uses the word mad rush. Mad rush in several places. There are mad rush, including RE sectors. In Thailand, one of the most the fastest speed who got rich in energy sector, and they are very able. And so I don't have to go much into that side of the story, but we have less and less trust how we can have a place to discuss and how can we engage in more, not just one shot, but engage in agenda worthwhile for us to be more transformative, to go beyond the usual context. We would like to see a bit more of this healthier context of exchange and also trust building, not sweet romantic trust. I mean the trust which are losing every day in the light of how we deal with the problems around us. I'm speaking just to remind myself that Thailand, finally, we are going to have a general election. There is no political party engaged with this kind of just recovery or green recovery industry. I mentioned this in the light of Friday. I was here. There was a conference organized among them. The key organizers were small fishermen from the sea, and the title is "Crisis of certain name of the fish, pratu, wicked pratu." Crisis of certain fish, but who owns and the responsibility to the ocean? Who should be responsible for the ocean? And the question asked directly to all of us, while the people risked their being arrested when they were campaigning against the so-called model industrial projects for the future, which are all imported model without any care for the local say biodiversity where they live with the sea. I'm saying this so small power, so little power people, so determined to protect the environments, but also so difficult to engage in the public discourse. But there were efforts to make this going, but this would not be able to continue without a more systematic, a more network building across our, say, country-specific efforts. So I just say this in the light of even the whole UN system are under crisis of legitimacy, whether they are really meaningful enough, doing anything meaningful enough in the light of these imbalances, global imbalances, and also worsening situation for our well-being for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for what I found to be quite powerful and moving words. I think you helped steer our moral compass on what must ground our approach and framework to address these very complex issues. No, but as you remind us, are at the same time also quite basic and simple in terms of our human relations and rights to our biophysical environment. I thought that was a really wonderful, powerful way to end the three talks and also set us up for the rest of the day. So thank you very much, John. So we have 10, maybe we can get away with 15 minutes for question and answer and a bit of discussion before our first coffee break. Maybe I'll take hopefully a few questions at once, and then we can have our panelists give the responses. So first, I'll take questions from the floor before moving to our virtual audience. Yes.
Sam Gill, China Dialogue. Thank you so much for those initial remarks. I found that really interesting and really great opening. I have.
May I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Sam Gill from China Dialogue, based in London. China Dialogue is an independent non-profit journalism platform focused on all things climate change and environment, with a special focus on China. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions based on your opening remarks. A couple of kind of shorter, more points of information type questions, and then maybe a slightly more general one. On shorter questions, I found that really illuminating presentation. On the traffic lights system, I'm still unclear about, even though I've seen this before, I'm still unclear about one thing, which is quite a basic question, which is to say, does it really have any force or any teeth? So, you know, if you're on the red list, is that enforced in any meaningful way? Can you actually cut off credit to, or does anyone have the ability to actually withdraw credit from companies, for example, that invest in coal? Has a company ever been penalized for breaking those rules? Second question is about rates of lending and capital cost. It's, you know, that's something that's increasingly on the agenda in climate talks, thanks to sort of the leadership of the Bahamas and some other countries. But Barbados and some other countries. The rate of lending from Chinese financial institutions, what does it look like? Are there concessional loans, or are these loans at kind of commercial rates? And if so, how do they average out? And then a bigger question, I guess, is to what extent is there a conversation in the green BRI institutions and sort of policy making apparatus about transition minerals, and the need presumably to corner the market in key minerals such as cobalt and lithium and so on. Many of the countries implicated here are some of the least developed countries that are worst affected by the effects of climate change. And there's enormous interest now in sort of cornering those markets, and then presumably these are now very implicated in some of the big investments overseas. And yet I don't see it as yet in the discussions around the green BRI, but presumably it should be.
Thank you for those. fun working with those questions. Before we hear from Wei Shin, is there another question or two from the floor? Yes, thank you.
Hello, I'm Sue from Myanmar. I'm currently a graduate student here at Chulalongkorn University in Development Studies. I happen to work in the energy sector in Myanmar, and I am very curious about the green initiative movement from China, as currently the energy projects in Myanmar have been very much China monopolized. We have a gas-fired power plant project just launched last month, and another power plant project, LNG power project, which has been in scene since last 5 years, but most of the international companies have been quitted from it due to the economic viability problems and the huge environmental impacts, being that based in the Delta area of Myanmar. But we have heard that the military have approved that power plant project to be awarded to Chinese company back in May last year, but we haven't had any updates from it since. And we don't know if there is any ESIA assessments going on right now, but the power plant project is causing a huge impact, and it is expected to impact hugely in the agricultural and food security sector for the Delta mostly. So we are very much concerned about it at the moment. Do you think the green initiative and the frameworks that are currently going on could be extended to such kind of projects in a very vulnerable situation as Burma? Thank you.
Take one more question, preferably one that brings in our other two speakers. Yes. Please try to keep your answers succinct. Thank you.
Right. So try to make it as brief as possible. The traffic light system is not yet in effect, because MEE itself is not in the decision-making system yet. So that's why MEE trying to use its think tank networks to propose such a system so that can have a bigger say in the decision-making system. That's the situation here. But it is the first time for us to see a Chinese central ministry having a kind of a guideline type of thing to say, well, this should be the way of forward. So that's something that I think should be, yeah, it should be regarded as a good news at least. But MEE, you know, traditionally they don't have much teeth, as you said. For the domestic issues, they are gradually becoming more powerful. But for overseas, it's yet happening. But it will affect the mindset of the SOEs at least to think about when they're trying to, particularly for the coal. I don't think it's any problem. Coal is off the table completely. But it's just for oil and large hydro that may, you know, still kind of negotiable from time to time in some countries and so on. At current, as I said, any project proposals, they don't need to go through MEE, and they just report to the Minister of Finance. And if Minister of Finance say yes, my money, green light, they can go ahead. But I think in the future, once we have these guidelines in place, you know. This related to your second question. It's about minerals, because I think minerals are less relevant in this region. But we have several questions already. For cobalt and lithium, particularly in Africa and Argentina, most of them, it's very different from energy sector because they are done mainly by private companies who are pursuing these opportunities through, first, they are not EPCs. They really invest their money in there as an equity investor for a long time. At least I think, for example, if you look at Zimbabwe, the lithium they're taking for at least 15 years, 12 to 15 years for most of the mines they're taking up. So the regulation at the moment for them is weak, but some of the problems that mentioned previously, for example, in DR Congo, previously Huayou, as a mining company, Huayou Cobalt, was sued by, I think, as a human rights abuse case for using child labor. They claim that, you know, before their investment, the child labor was already there. They just continue to practice. They don't even realize there's a problem like that or things like that. But the things is that that's why it was first overseas investment. They really learned a lesson. I think it's like 4 or 5 years ago. They did a lot of things, try to save their image and so on. And domestically, there's an industrial association created. Nowadays, we've been engaging with them that they're trying to check in all these kind of industrial members' overseas behavior as a reference for their future bidding through the government. It's like, you know, it's an indirect kind of constraint. But because lithium and cobalt, everybody's rushing into it. There's again huge competition in this area. So every Chinese company is trying to expose each other, saying, "Well, you're not doing good. I'm the better one," and so on. So that can be, as a political economist, I always like, you know, taking this as opportunities as an industrial association to have more stringent regulations and so on. But still, governing private companies could be difficult. They are not like SOEs that the party can just say, well, stop doing that, and they stop. That's for the minerals. For the minerals in the Myanmar case, I have less knowledge about that. I'll be very happy to hear more. But I think your case raised another issue. Is like probably this is the existing projects. It's not really the new projects that goes through the approval. Another issue of the environmental and social impact assessment is that we don't have this kind of a looking back system. That if they don't really follow the previous report, that what shall we do? What kind of penalties should be in place? Because everybody just run away. The DFI say, well, it's not my problem because, you know, it should be based on your due diligence, not mine, and so on. So everybody is kind of shoving around to say it's not their responsibilities. There must be some accountability system to say, well, for example, if it is a foreign direct investment, who should be responsible? If it is a construction project, who should be responsible? Because for construction companies, for EPC contractors, it's very easy for them to get away. They say, well, you want it, not me. You want me to build this like this? I build this for you. You know, if there's a problem, it's a problem, right? I get away with it. So different project types need different accountability system. So that should be developed. I think, like a looking back system should be developed as well. For the Myanmar power sector projects, China has been the last resort for many years. I think the first project, and most of the developers are from the Yunnan province, and they received tremendous support from the Yunnan government. And because there are lots of other projects going on, like rubber and so on, plantation and so on. So the interest group is pretty strong. The environmental assessment mainly done by the SOE's kind of in-house expertise group. But increasingly, China Exim Bank are now requesting external ones if they are suspect of the quality of these projects. But again, as I said, the DFIs they think they're not responsible for the quality of these reports. So hopefully, under this traffic light system, they will, you know, have some kind of rules on them. But at the moment, it's difficult as far as I see. And the problem is for Myanmar market is that there's absolutely no competition at all. It's like if you want these power plants, the Chinese are the only ones you can go for. And that's the problem. That's related to the question about the rates, and that's why even the concessional rates are going higher and higher, because in some markets there's no competition. And because the Chinese lending is shrinking, again, this is a good opportunity. I think in one of my slides, it's a good opportunity for triangular cooperation, triangular kind of a projects that if you can invite local development banks at a national level or regional level, that could be a opportunity to have some strains on these activities. One of the example in Argentina, for example, during the COVID time, is like there's a conflict because this co-funding between IFC and China Exim and insured by Sinocure. And then during the COVID, there's a different opinions about COVID rules because China got very stringent COVID rules. Nobody move, everybody stay in the camp. And the local workers just don't like that. And the IFC don't like that kind of rules. There's a kind of a dispute about working conditions, about all this type of COVID related rules and so on. The Chinese may think it's a kind of a new burden to them, but it's also a learning journey for them, because if they need cooperation with local development agencies, that is the learning journey they have to take on, rather than look at it as a pure kind of a trouble. So again, raising competitive markets is probably the only way I think to move forward. I said I try to make it short, but it's not short. I'm sorry.
You did an incredible job answering so many questions. Thank you for your key insights. And just to quickly conclude the panel, I want to open the opportunity for the other two panelists to say anything to lead us on our way.
I can go first. I'll bring up the rear.
I listen to you, to your engaging with the questions. For me, it is not about China. For me, it is about how we all are dealing with very difficult situation, where in Myanmar, the situation already elaborated. And some of you living in Thailand, and also not so enabling in some aspects. So I listen from that aspects. So my 2 points relate to, I just want to strengthen how the words used by our colleagues from Myanmar, illegal business, could be framed in the light of policy discussion in the global level. Questioning the legitimacy of business and human rights forum, pushing them to engage further. Not so challenge. I see illegal, or what some people would call illicit flows. So see, all these terminology are captured by certain disciplines in the debates on the sustainable development politics into the future. So I think along that line, I am much interested in what you said, but because we do have discussion about Sihanoukville in Cambodia, we do have discussion about casinos at the borders, right? Myanmar, in certain state, we do have a recovery issue, very challenging issue of how the Thai economy is to recover after this COVID, and the biggest parliamentary commission for the first time. There are 60 some members of member committee under the name of recovery. Please be reminded, it's recovery politics, but the title of the commission is called, the committee is called entertainment complex plus, and recovery of the local economies after COVID. That were very well integrated, including gambling, etc., etc. So my point here is and they already negotiated with certain sectors in China. They already have a lot of photo session, but I'm talking about this in the light of we are going to have election, and those politics are much active. How to move ahead? Why we don't have any? We are a bit lacking of the substantive issue on the future of development policy beyond COVID. But entertainment policy comes in a big package with all this, whatever, including even hospital in the entertainment politics, whatever. Okay, so that is my point. So how to engage this further and deepen them, not make the case as just a separate case of Myanmar and China. And it is a very much a challenging one. And I am interested to see how the indigenous issues of the people that you did mention be framed in along that kind of issues, rather than wisdom of the local vis-a-vis the modern science issue alone. So I'm interested in along that line how we frame this issue in the light of very clear, responsible, climate finance from the COP27. They have very strong ground on the indigenous net alliance in the world. They are not betting the future with the other sector, but they bet their future with how the indigenous people's network can get engaged, and that is very challenging.
Okay, I'll also be very quick. I just wanted 3 points very quickly that I want to say. Well, the first one is that I want to people to recognize more overtly that environmental, ecological rights issues are indeed financial, economic issues. There's often a tendency among policy makers to think of things that are hard issues and soft issues, the way they differentiate between hard law and soft law. But the history of the world teaches us this, and financialization, financial globalization, which is what is characterizing the world economy today. Financialization has increasingly moved into the environmental, into the realm of nature. And this has been enabled through the climate crisis. The climate crisis has become an opportunity for bringing financialization into nature. And if you look at the elements of the green economy and the blue economy that were presented at the Rio plus whatever, by UNEP, these are multilateral economic systems that are being pushed. So this is a very serious issue for green transition. And if we look at the way green transition is being framed, it's becoming a cover for the operations of big data, big tech, big digital, big agribusiness and assets management firms to take over the building blocks of life. And this is a very serious issue. It's an economic issue. It's not just a soft, human rights are never soft, but I think you get my point here. And we have to tackle these as dangers to the economy and to the world systems and rights and so on. And the final point here is that, we have a crisis of multilateralism. And if you look at over the last 20, 25 years, multi-stakeholderism has been on the rise. From the launch of the Global Compact to the Millennium Development Goals, even the UNGA, the UN Guiding Principles, the Ruggie Principles, they're based on voluntary codes of conduct. The Sustainable Development Goals have been the biggest boondoggle of our times in terms of multilateralism. Because they put corporations on the table with equal negotiating power as states. And corporations have way more money than governments do. Governments are ridden with debt. We know all that. That's why people go to corporations, One credit rating move by a financial asset management firm can bring economies tumbling down. That's how powerful they are. And they are at the negotiating tables in the United Nations through a system of network multilateralism that the UN Secretary General is promoting. And this is a very serious issue. So, and I think going forward, in addition to supporting the fights at the local level, the struggles at the local level of those who are actually producing our food and sustaining the ecosystems, we need to also claim governance back. I think we have to demand that we are the people of the United Nations. We are the rights holders. Corporations are not rights holders. We have to change that discourse. And I think, so why don't I just leave it at that? Okay, because I know.
Thank you, everyone. This was just a really wonderful panel, and I think we're off to a great start today. So thank you so much.
Sorry, Kevin.
Thanks so much, Kevin, too. So we will take a coffee break. There's coffee outside for 15 minutes. Thanks. We're ready to begin. I'd like to invite Rajesh Daniel with the Stockholm Environment Institute, who will be moderating this second session.
Thank you, Carl. Just waiting for the last few stragglers. So welcome back, everyone, for session 2. As Kevin said earlier, we had a very strong start to the first session. Let's keep going with that momentum. We have in this session 4 speakers, 2 of whom are online. And one of them I hear is actually in London. It's kind of 4 a.m. So let's keep going as soon as we can. And there are other 2 panelists in the room with us. So we are following the same format. We will give about 15 minutes for the speakers. Hold your questions till they are all finished. And then we will do a questions and discussion after they have finished. So can I start with, and if One Pen is online, could I start with One Pen, who is the farthest away from us and at a very difficult time zone as well?
Hi, yes. I'm not. Hi, Rajesh.
Yes, she's here. One Pen, very good morning, very early morning. Thank you for joining us at this hour. For you, we would invite you to present for about 15 minutes. Please go ahead, you have the floor.
I didn't prepare much of a presentation. Would it be okay if other speakers go first?
Okay, sure. We can do that. Could we go to the next online speaker, please, then? Sunil Acharya.
Hello, thank you. I'm Sunil Acharya. I'm the Regional Policy and Campaigns Coordinator with Oxfam in Asia. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for this opportunity to provide our insights in this important seminar. I'm dialing in here from Kathmandu and very happy to be with the audience, both joining online as well as physically there in Bangkok. So I'd like to focus my intervention on the fact that whatever we talk about the need for green transformation or the need for building resilience of the communities who are bearing the impacts of climate change, which they didn't cause in the first place, it's something which requires is money or the finance. So my focus of my intervention today will be looking into the status of what finance is required for the countries in Asia and what is being delivered and where things are. So if I may, I'd like to basically share my screen so that it's a bit easier. Is my slide visible?
Yes, it is visible.
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, I'll just take it to, yeah. So, yeah, basically I'll discuss a bit about, starting with the reminder of what are the global climate finance needs, specifically in terms of adapting to and dealing with irreversible impacts of climate change. And then I'll go into a bit of climate crisis in Asia. And then I'll talk about what is required for Asia, and then how much of that is being delivered, and is it in the form that is required for the countries in Asia. And we'll end with some recommendations, but also showing you some key steps and takeaways. So yeah, if we look into the scale of problem and what is required financially to deal with this crisis, you can see the figures. These are not new figures, but being estimated by a few different agencies and researchers. So, for developing countries globally to adapt to the climate crisis, it is estimated that between 315 to 565 billion is required by 2050. But if you look into the irreversible or the impacts, which we call is loss and damage in developing countries, which cannot be mitigated or adapted to, the costs are between the range of 1 trillion to 1.8 trillion by 2050. So what does this mean is that the way the climate crisis is escalating and the way this is being handled, there is this inaction and delay in making progress. So the cost will rise significantly, and then these costs will continue to rise. But in the international climate regime, what we are operating is in the promise that the developed countries will provide 100 billion per year between 2020 and 2025, which they have not delivered. So looking into the situation we are in Asia, I'll not go into details because all of you know this. We in Asia have been confronting the increasing rise in temperature and then increasing level of disasters compounded by the climate crisis. So this includes the fast onset or extreme events such as the cyclones, floods, etc., but also slow onset events such as the rise of sea level, which brings whole range of other impacts. So yeah, if we look into the kind of situation the countries in Asia, because I'm basing this presentation based on the recent study Oxfam conducted looking into the status quo of climate finance in 18 different countries in Asia, which primarily include countries from Southeast and South Asia. So the countries in Asia are at the varying level of vulnerability, but also at the varying level of preparedness. So, for example, countries in South Asia like Cambodia or Myanmar, and some of those in South Asia, such as Bangladesh or Afghanistan, are more vulnerable and less, prepared to deal with the climate crisis. But again, there are few countries whose vulnerabilities are less and are also much more prepared, such as the countries like Japan or Singapore. So that's the complexity of Asia in terms of climate crisis. So, but if you look into what is required, and I'm basing this on the stated needs, the countries provide their estimates of what is required to the United Nations Climate Change Convention in the form of their nationally determined contributions. And if you look into those stated needs, and to tell you the truth that not every country has provided the estimates. So whatever is available, it shows that around 11.8 trillion US dollar will be required by 2030 to meet their climate action plans, their climate commitments, which comes to about 1.3 trillion per year. But this figure also includes China. If we discount the needs of China, then still the countries in Asia we have looked into will require around 3.2 trillion up to 2030, which is around 371 billion per year in average. So this is the kind of scale of financial needs that these countries have. But as I mentioned, many countries have not, provided the estimate of what is required. For example, if you look into Sri Lanka, they said that their focus is on reducing losses and damages and on adaptation, and for which they require huge amount of investment, but they have not been able to determine the estimate of the costs required. So that's where we are. So, but now if you look into what is being delivered, the figure that I'm showing is at the face value what the developed countries who are historically responsible for the climate crisis and also have promised to deliver climate finance to developing countries have just, from 2013 to 2020, if you look into the total figures, they have just, said that they have provided 113 billion over this period, which comes to about an average of 14 billion a year. So that's against the backdrop of the needs which that countries have estimated to be 1.3 trillion per year from 2020 until 2030. So that shows that the scale of needs are way much higher than what is being now being delivered. And if you look into this figure, though there is an uptick in 2020, but the actual amount of finance remains stagnant from 2013 until now. So that's the kind of situation we are into. So again, showing what is required versus what is being delivered, as I said. So just around 113 billion, or which comes to 14 billion per year, has been provided from 2013 to 2020. But the costed needs are in the tune of 1.3 trillion per year, including Chinese, needs for climate action. But also, even if you discount that, there will be 371 billion per year that is required until 2030, based on the estimated needs, which are insufficient. That's the minimum, needs. So just to showcase through this figure the needs versus availability. So if you go into more details of the reported climate finance, there is a clear mitigation bias. Though we know that we will require finance through transition from fossil fuel-based economy to the economy that is based on non-polluting renewable energy sources. But if you look into what has happened so far, is that the 2/3 of whatever is available is for mitigation. So that goes towards actually reducing the impact, the climate change. But again, for adaptation, it's only 1/3. Though there is a positive trend that the adaptation finance is increasing, but it is still not sufficient, and it is still not near enough to what was promised to make that balance between mitigation and adaptation finance, the 50-50 balance of the fact that the international climate finance, international public climate finance should be balanced 50% to adaptation and 50% to mitigation. That has not happened. But the more worrying fact is that most of the money that has been provided is in the form of loans. If you look into the figures, only 12% of the climate finance, the international climate finance that came into Asia from 2013 to 2020 was in the form of grants, and the remaining 55% was concessional debt instruments, and 33% was non-concessional debt instruments, which means that the kind of climate finance the countries in Asia are receiving are loans. And again, to bring that, to remind that climate crisis is primarily caused by developed countries who are historically responsible for that. And the principle of climate justice says that the money that needs to be provided by them needs to be in the form of grants or grant equivalent at least. But if you look into these figures, this is a very worrying figure. If you also, go into further details, the bilateral, providers are the grant component of the bilateral climate finance is around 18%, and more worryingly, the multilateral providers provide grant at the scale of just about 5%. So that means 95% of the money that they have been mobilizing is in the form of loans. So further looking into this figure again, so we looked into what the reported climate finance is. That's 14 billion per year in average. But if you look into the grant equivalent, so the figures are way less. And also to point to the fact that the amount of finance that is coming in, looking from 2013 to 2020, the worrying fact is that the level of concessionality, that means the figure for grants is decreasing instead of which should have increased. So it shows that the providers of international climate finance are giving money at market rates, increasingly at market rates, or at the non-concessional terms. So that's where we are. So to come back to what is required to be done going forward, we've seen that COP27, despite this historical decision to create a loss and damage fund, we are at this stage when there is no enough action coming in from the developed, historically responsible countries. And then if we look specifically into the finance side, for everything, for mitigation or adaptation or loss and damage, despite that part being created, we see that there is the acute lack of the money that the developing countries require to both deal with the crisis and also transition away from fossil fuel-based economy to renewable economy. It is critically needed that the international climate finance, especially for the adaptation, it needs to be doubled based on their promise in Glasgow in COP26. They said that they would, double it, but coming to COP27, they didn't mention anything. They just recognized that, the finance needs to be scaled up, but, they didn't show us the pathway or the roadmap on how they will scale up the financing required for adaptation to climate change, which should
basically— You have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm just about to finish it. Thank you. So we also need to, emphasize the fact that the money that is required for adaptation should be grant-based. And we also, in our report, looked into what is, though it is very challenging to look how the money that comes to national level goes into the local level, but our indicators show that just about 0.5% of the total climate finance can be termed locally led, which needs to be, to be turned down. That means more and more money should be locally led, that should go to the communities who are at the forefront of climate change and who know how to deal with those crises. And also, we are also looking into the post-2025 climate finance goal, which should be established based on the needs and not based on the political signpost. And then we also, call upon the providers of the international climate finance to base their financing on grant equivalence, and also the fact that there should be no non-concessional finance provided for adaptation. And then there is also the recommendations for the countries in Asia. For example, we saw through our research that the costing is not sufficient. They face problems or barriers with coming up with the costing, both for mitigation and adaptation, which needs to be standardized. They require assistance in coming up with costed needs. And then the issue of conditional versus unconditional, because many of the estimates do not distinguish what the countries themselves will be able to invest in and what they require from international climate finance, because we've not been saying that almost all of the investment should come from developed countries. The developing countries have themselves said that they would also invest on their own. That should also be stipulated or clarified. So we know that Asia is vulnerable to the climate crisis. We know that the amount of climate finance that is being mobilized is insufficient, which should be turned out. Without this, we cannot talk about this green transition. So to basically build the resilience of the impacted and also to transition to the green societies, the status quo needs to change, and that needs to change urgently. So I'll finally leave with the key stats. This is coming from the report, and I've mentioned this time and again. And this small step should change and also. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sunil. Extremely informative presentation on the lived dilemma between mitigation and adaptation, and whether communities are actually getting the support they need for reducing loss from climate disasters. Thank you for all the facts as well. With that, can I move to Sam Gill as the next on the panel? Please introduce yourself briefly, and then you can go ahead with your talk, Sam.
Thanks very much, Rajesh. So yeah, I'm Sam Gill. I'm Chief Executive at China Dialogue. I thought I'd say a few words for my intervention about China's role at COP27, its role in Southeast Asia, and this, I guess, will feed into what Joydeep is going to talk about around the outcomes of COP27 and so on. So I won't say too much about what happened there. I thought what would be helpful is to say something about how I think we can best think about China in order to understand its drivers and sort of where it sits at this moment. And I think in order to do that, it's best to really think about China's own national policy drivers, its own national policies, its national self-interest, and the kind of complex domestic politics and geopolitics that are affecting the country's stance on climate and where it now is. I think the place to start there is actually to think about China this summer, when it struggled with extreme heat. In fact, it suffered the worst heat wave on record in the world. It's worth clarifying that because it's really unusual. This was actually the worst heat wave ever recorded globally. Severe droughts led to shortages of electricity due to hydropower dependency in a number of Western provinces. The first nationwide drought warning in nearly a decade. In Sichuan province, you had factories closing for weeks, and you also had parts of the country hit by flooding. So really extraordinary, extreme global temperatures, and China already facing a very steep economic and human cost as a result of this. That China is highly vulnerable to climate change isn't news for Chinese policymakers. The government released its first national assessment on climate change in 2006. It's now preparing its fourth. These long integrated reports detail many risks posed by climate change to China's water, food, and energy systems, its vitally important glaciers, and more. And these impacts will worsen. They're clearly going to be devastating for harvests. They're going to worsen droughts, inundate coastal areas in high emissions scenarios. And that's not really disputed at a national level. Chen Lichuan is the chief forecaster at China's National Climate Center, and he said this year that climate change could make these sorts of deadly heat waves the new normal in China. And the policy response at this point, I think, is also undisputed. China's dual carbon goals to peak emissions before 2030 and reach net zero by 2060 have had an enormous impact. And there's actually little doubt about the scale of commitment at this point. So, you know, at the UN General Assembly in September 2020, people will remember that President Xi Jinping made this actually quite unprecedented and unexpected commitment on trying to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. This genuinely took environmental policymakers by surprise, and it led to a pretty significant policy response. We've seen since then a raft of policymaking. So the integration of decarbonization plans through every sector of the economy, from rural revitalization to steel to plastic production. So it really doesn't matter what sector you're working in at this point. There will now have been a sort of decarbonization plan that has been set out through these kind of large, centralized, integrated economic planning bodies. And we saw the same emphasis in the 20th Party Congress to a degree, where Xi Jinping, of course, was also given his third term in an unprecedented sort of act of party consolidation. we also saw Xi Jinping talk about the need to, quote unquote, speed up the green transformation. Although as well, and I'll come back to this, to quote unquote, build the new before destroying the old, a new emphasis on the idea of trying to make sure that there is a quote unquote orderly transition, one that doesn't lead to, as there was last summer, a wave of blackouts and so on, as the transition was seen to have kind of taken place in a way that created kind of local inflation and various other issues. And of course, including as part of that transformation, the quote unquote clean and efficient use of coal-fired power. Again, I'll come back to that in a moment. But I would like to emphasize, because I do think it's important for how we just model sort of the role of China here, that there's very little doubt, I think, that climate action that has been taken on by China is in China's own national self-interest. In order to address climate vulnerabilities, as I mentioned, that are widely understood sort of at a central government level, but also to move the economy up the value chain, by moving the economy away from polluting, energy-intensive, costly manufacturing towards innovation and services, to take a leading position in the clean technology markets that will be needed for a carbon-constrained future, for energy security by moving away from imported fossil fuels, with all of the geopolitical entanglements and pricing volatility that's implied there, and also, of course, for reasons of party legitimacy. There's major public concern about the scale of environmental degradation in China. Being seen to act on issues of public concern is important, particularly in a context of slowing growth, where you need to seek new basis for legitimacy. Being seen to act in favor of a slower, higher quality growth, one that's more balanced with other sorts of needs, including environmental degradation, is important. It's part of the calculus, and it's part of the calculus at a party level. And yet, there's a lot of different complicating factors and politics that play out through these sorts of decisions, both domestic and geopolitical. The international politics continue to complicate these efforts. One notable moment came in August this year, when Beijing suspended its long-planned US-China talks on climate change over Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. At COP27, there was some small shift here. There was a meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping at the G20 in Indonesia, and informally it saw those talks resume. But it's fair to say there's little shared basis for really substantive cooperation here. The geopolitics and the kind of optimistic framing that shaped the Paris Agreement and the shared diplomatic bedrock, actually, of that agreement that came out of the 2014 meeting between Xi Jinping and Barack Obama hasn't really sort of resumed, and it leaves things in a much more geopolitically kind of tense moment. And I think it's also worth considering the sort of global energy market turmoil, inflation, and all of the other kind of unfolding crises, conflict, COVID, climate change impacts, and these sort of global economic headwinds, and the way those are helping to create a much more unstable and uncertain kind of macro environment in which China's domestic policies have been hedged as a result. We've seen, for example, a lot of emphasis in recent Chinese energy planning documents and policies around the need to build up, quote unquote, supply reserves. So an emphasis on stability and security over the short term. And this has meant, for example, in April last year, Premier Li Keqiang talking about the creation of new coal-fired power capacity in China. But it's worth emphasizing that actually domestic coal mining, for example, hasn't ramped up, and nor has utilization of coal. So there's an emphasis on building out supply reserves in order to sort of hedge over the short term, and yet coal generation does actually continue to fall and demand continues to soften. And I wouldn't necessarily expect coal generation to ramp up in either. It may well have actually peaked historically, given the sort of overall trajectory of growth. What's more worrying, I would say, is not that China's own domestic environmental efforts are backsliding. I think what's more worrying is that international environmental cooperation is being held hostage by the geopolitics at the moment, and the scope for any kind of progress through international coordination and cooperation has really narrowed in recent years. One place where we might have seen progress, for example, would have been in coordination between the COP15 biodiversity talks where China holds the presidency and the UNFCCC climate process, and yet there's been vanishingly little scope for that coordination or apparent leadership from China in this respect. These talks, they had their initial phase in Kunming last year. They're now going to take place formally in Montreal after China said it can no longer host them, largely due to COVID. But these are sort of long delayed and quite underpowered, and haven't really seen any scope for coordination but between the processes, the climate and biodiversity processes. Thinking about our colleague from Focus on the Global South comments earlier about the number of lobbyists at COP27. I recently asked someone who watches the COP15 talks closely, is there the same presence there, from the food and agriculture lobby and so on? She said, I wish there was, because it would at least show that, these were now taken seriously in the same way that the COP27 talks were, where all of the big fossil fuel companies and so on turn out because they know these are going to affect things. Unfortunately, the CBD COP15 process has been so kind of underpowered that even the big corporates haven't really started lobbying yet. So that particular process, unfortunately, hasn't really been a kind of an opportunity, hasn't really been raised up. But where are there areas of opportunity and where might work kind of resume around international coordination and engagement? I'd say there are a few areas where I still think, and I feel like there might be progress to sort of work over the next year and find kind of points of coordination, or find points where there might be synergies and where China might show some leadership. The first is that as I mentioned, China's progress in renewables is extraordinary. We've largely due to the economic and technological forces that have really been unleashed through the low carbon transition to date in China. We've seen extraordinary kind of leadership there, often, as I say, sort of just unleashed through private enterprise and other areas. I mean, China has continued to exceed its own targets on renewables. They installed, I think, 300 gigawatts of solar power last year. I mean, 300 gigawatts in cumulatively by last year of solar power alone. So absolutely extraordinary kind of numbers. And much of that today is not just at the large scale kind of utility grade. A lot of it is increasingly distributed power. Some of these are microgrids and off-grid types of generation. In other words, the sorts of generation that can serve the needs of the poor and that can actually fill really needed sort of installations in Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia where there's extraordinary need for development. So there are opportunities here that China could take. There's also, I think, a soft power element that could be better harnessed in this regard. At the UN, part of the reason that China, of course, wanted to host the Convention on Biological Diversity was Xi Jinping's own kind of signature leadership brand of so-called ecological civilization, something that is actually, now part of the title of the UN talks themselves on Convention on Biological Diversity. Again, there is an opportunity there to kind of leverage that, or to take the opportunity, and yet it hasn't really seemed to have been taken. And then I think there's going to have to be, and this gets to the more difficult and kind of difficult questions I think that are raised by some of the points that Sunil Acharya was raising about around loss and damage and adaptation. There is going to be, I think, a more active and an interesting conversation around the role of China in climate finance after the development or after the writing into the COP27 outcome of a loss and damage fund. Where China sits here, I think, is in dispute. Clearly, it's going to be raised up the agenda. It's evident, I think, that there wasn't going to be a deal made where China would immediately come and say that it would pay into any fund that was established by the rich countries. They couldn't have on the hoof decided to give up on the common but differentiated responsibilities framework. However, I do think this is going to play out in interesting ways. I think there's going to be a larger discussion, and China does have a lot of South-South cooperation funds committed. So how that plays out and where China sort of pays into this, I think is going to be increasingly important. And I think, for the world's poorest people who are disproportionately suffering the effects of climate change, this is really an absolutely critical question where I hope China will be able to demonstrate greater leadership. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sam. Thanks also for keeping it tight and on time. It's staggering, the numbers as usual with China. 300 gigawatts of solar cumulatively. That's a huge number. But I'm sure this will be taken up in the questions. Why hasn't this kind of percolated outward to the region more in other areas of China's cooperation? For example, the Langchang-Mekong partnership. But I'm sure we'll discuss all that in the questions. Can I go to Joydeep, Wanpen, or would you still like to be the last, or would you want to step in now? I'm giving you an opportunity.
I can step in now and speak quickly more about the Mekong. Just
okay. Is that okay, Joydeep?
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Joydeep. Wanpen, please introduce yourself briefly, and then you have the floor.
Yes, I just made a quick presentation. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I'm Wanpen Pachai. That's my pen name, or you can just call me Jeannie. I'm a journalist covering Thailand and Southeast Asia. So I've worked with China Dialogue, also with Rajesh at SEI and Earth Journalism Network. So I think for today, I'll just talk quickly about Thailand hydropower and how it plays a role with like Mekong and everything. So from my reporting experience, last year I did a data journalism story, looking at why Thailand buys electricity from Laos. So already a lot of people already know how large hydropower projects are bad for the environment and the community, and how Thailand actually buys a lot of hydropower from Laos in our electrical system. But like a lot of the media stories and a lot of the dialogue, it didn't make a lot of sense on why Thailand would buy hydropower from Laos or continue to sponsor these large projects, because there's protests from communities along the Mekong River that Thai-Lao borders. Environmentally, we know from studies that it's bad and it affects the whole delta. And Thailand also has an electricity surplus, and also there's a push for other forms of renewable. So, but when you look at the data, both at the national level and at Stimson Center has a dam, like a satellite map where they have all the data on who sponsors each project. I found that it was actually quite a big business environment politically, and also with Thai businesses to go invest in Laos because of the power purchase agreements. And then in Thailand, we have an FT, a monopoly with an FT system where it feeds into one another. Where if you were to invest and build a hydropower project in Laos, for example, you could get returns because the government has agreed to buy electricity from that project, regardless of how much you use or whether you need it or not. So, for example, the cost of electricity per unit, the average cost of production is around 6 baht versus if you were to purchase from Laos or hydropower, it's still much more affordable than solar. First, as you click in this graph, but I think solar is now decreasing quite a bit, but still like Laos hydropower, the price is still quite competitive for Thailand to buy. And Thailand is still heavily dependent on non-renewable energy, but with goals to push for like more renewable energy, hydropower is in that gray area of whether it's considered renewable and green or it's not, because there's others such as solar, which is more environmentally friendly. And now that we look at Thailand, for Laos, it's a big part of their GDP as well. Hydropower helps to fuel their economic growth. So altogether, once you look into Thailand, is that once Thai engineering firms invest in hydropower projects in Laos, which the Laos government also enjoys because it's a big part of their GDP, they're able to sell it back to Thailand, and through purchasing power agreements, that makes sure that there is a steady revenue, and then Thai consumers actually have very little say on what goes on because of how EGAT works, and the FT cost is not that transparent. So it's all, even though consumers, like an average person in Bangkok might not need that electricity or want to have a greater say on how they use, where their electricity come from because of the consequences, there's still very little you can do to change the makeup of electricity in Thailand. So that was, I think that was a story on how like there's a strong political and business environment in Thailand and in Laos for hydropower. And yeah, maybe it's difficult to change. And recently also, there's even a bigger market just to export it to Singapore, and just even if Thailand has a surplus, it could be a gateway through other Southeast Asian countries. Yeah, I hope that is relevant to the talk right now. But other than that, some other reporting I've kind of covered more on sugarcane burning or mangroves or plastic. I always feel like the community has taken more action and mobilized against what they think is like an important cause of climate change or a consequence of climate change. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Jeannie. Jeannie has worked closely with us with Third Pole and Internews. And I would encourage you to go read her photojournalism on bioeconomy as well. Thanks, Jeannie, for bringing up this topic of hydropower. This is a large beast when very critical to this topic of this session on climate justice. So on that note, can I go to Joydeep? Thanks for your patience, Joydeep, and please briefly introduce yourself and then you have the floor.
Thanks, Rajesh. Hello, everyone. My name is Joydeep Gupta. I work for the Third Pole, which is a joint project of the China Dialogue Trust and the Earth Journalism Network. So I do have a lot of colleagues in this room, but I'm also extremely excited to have a lot of social scientists in this room, because as a reporter, I get to speak and get to ask questions quite often on climate to natural scientists. And I'm increasingly of the view that this is something that in which social scientists have a much bigger role to play than they have played so far. I'm going to start on that, given the topic for this session was COP27 and climate justice. Historically, if you look at global climate talks, COP27 is a formal admission of the failure of climate talks. Climate talks started with mitigation. How do you control emissions of greenhouse gases so that you don't have a problem anymore? Mitigation failed to stop climate change and its impacts. Developing countries pushed, civil society pushed, managed to get adaptation on the agenda. That you're failing to mitigate, we need to adapt to the climate impacts that are happening already. There was huge pushback. Kyoto Protocol has nothing on adaptation. It's all about mitigation. And though even from that time, adaptation was supposed to be on the agenda, supposed to happen. And as was pointed out by my friend from Oxfam, adaptation still gets a very small part of climate finance. I'll come to the details later. The overall point I'm trying to make is that adaptation has increasingly failed because it has failed to keep in pace with climate impacts. And IPCC latest report states that in so many words, limits to adaptation is a very large part of IPCC's latest report. And so when you fail to adapt, you are left with loss and damage. So that is why I say that the establishment of a very, very small step and a step that is going, I suspect, is going to get huge pushback is actually an admission that global climate talks, since the Rio Conventions were signed in 1992, have not been able to solve the problem. So to me, as I said, I'm a reporter. I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm going to ask questions to the room in the hope that we can have a good discussion on this. So from historians and sociologists and economists, and especially from political scientists in the room, I ask this large question that when you have a transnational problem like climate change, when you have a transnational problem like air pollution, when you have a transnational problem like biodiversity loss, when you have a transnational problem with transnational rivers, is the sovereign state the right way to go about talking about it? Because I'm increasingly of the view that it's not. The Westphalian state for the last 500 years has failed to sort out any river issues significantly, when it comes to transboundary rivers. So is the nation state on which we are depending, the nation state on which the UN is structured on the basis of sovereignty, where you have a situation where any one of 197 countries can veto a global decision, as we have seen again and again, and we saw again this time at COP27. We have seen it in the biodiversity COPs, we have seen it in the desertification COPs. It's not just climate I'm talking about. And so my question overall to this room, and especially to the political scientists and sociologists here, is the nation state the correct way of going about it? Or can we think of a different way in which we should look at transboundary issues? There are examples of where it has actually worked. They're admittedly small examples, but there are examples at a decentralized community level where transboundary cooperation works. Later on, if I have time, I can state those examples. They are there in rivers. They're there in terms of air pollution issues occasionally. They are not there so much in climate, but it's something that we need to really talk about. Then I'm going to raise one more issue, because I want to raise this because it's part of the COP27 talks, and it's the question of climate justice comes in here in a big way. Now, there is a question of climate justice at the international level, which is what we are talking about. What we are not talking about, one of the elephants in the room, is climate injustice within a country. It's almost never being considered. The last report on it that I remember was a 2007 report on India by Greenpeace, which showed that the top 20% of the rich people of India took up 80% of India's carbon space of emissions at that point in time, which is exactly mirrors what the richest 43 countries in the world has taken, with 20% of the global population, has taken up of global carbon space since the start of the industrial age. So 20% of the countries, the richest 43 countries in the world, with 20% of the global population, take up 80% of the carbon space. In India, 20%, the richest 20% take up 80% of the carbon space. Same thing. In many ways, we need to confront these elephants in the room. But okay, it'll go all over the place if I talk about this. So I'll point out only one more thing. In climate change research and history, in the 1980s, when it really came to public attention from the Brundtland report of Our Common Future, one of the reports that came out was about the extent to which methane contributes to global warming. And at that point in time, there were many reports, especially in the industrialized countries, which said it's about 50-50 with carbon dioxide. And the sources of methane at that point in time were by and large identified as two: rice production and livestock rearing. It required concerted, combined scientific research within various global South labs and communities. I can name labs in Philippines, China, Thailand, and India, which work together on this to show that the percentages coming out of the labs in the US were wrong. And it was shown empirically, and it was shown also that only livestock and paddy growing are not the only causes of methane production. Flaring from oil and gas wells, it contributes well over a third of methane in the atmosphere. After that, there was the talk of methane sort of died down. Through the 90s, it actually came back in 2021. And now we have a global methane pledge, we have a report, and we are seeing similar kinds of reports. And I was looking at it to do a story, to see to what extent it actually empirically shows. And I found that there are two global sources right now available on how much methane is being emitted by various sources and how much is in the atmosphere. One is by something called the Global Methane Pledge, an organization set up in 2021 by a very large number of industrialized countries, in fact, most of them. And the other was by UN Environment Program. And I found the two have very different numbers. The numbers, in fact, are so different that I ended up not doing a story because I couldn't match them. So what I'm trying to tell all of you is that climate injustice happens at various levels. Climate injustice happens through various means, through various forms, and also through ill-planned solutions, which is where that other big elephant, which Rajesh just alluded to, comes in: hydropower. And I am seeing the governments of China, India, Myanmar, all saying that, oh yeah, we have to decarbonize. Fine, we'll have more hydropower. To me, as somebody who has been covering this area for a long time, large dams are a disaster, an absolute disaster. And to see that as a solution, as a decarbonizing solution, to me is plain wrong and needs to be discussed. I think I'm going to stop here. Hopefully I've raised some questions for discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joydeep. I would also add to your point on the methane and hydropower is that dams also were considered extremely bad, and then it led to protests worldwide, and then the world discussing dams. This also makes us reflect on another point about knowledge production, science. It's not neutral, it's value-laden, it's politically driven, and that's something that we should reflect on as well. So thank you very much to all the four speakers. We had kind of divergent threads, but also an overall pattern reflecting on climate justice and COP. I throw the floor open now to questions. Please keep your questions brief and please introduce yourselves when asking a question. Should we go online first, Carl, or is there anything doesn't matter? No questions online, so floor is open here. Question, please. Can you use the next one? I think we need the mic for the online, so it's better if you can use the mic.
Fantastic observation. Just a quick question about carbon markets and carbon pricing. Seems that it's been a kind of a hot topic until recently. So is it already dead in China? That's a quick question. And the second one is about top questions raised by Jay.
Sorry, Roshan, what was the first question?
I didn't hear the question, sir.
The question is about carbon pricing and carbon markets, and seems to be very popular until very recently. So what happened to the Chinese carbon market? And there seems to be a discussion among some of the scholars about linking China's carbon market with the global south, a kind of a new kind of a CDM type of thing but linked to Chinese market. So what do you think? Is that a good idea? And the second question probably is about the Jeannie's question about transmission infrastructure as a vested interest as well. We see many of these type of projects are being kind of invested. I think there's a new transporter transmission lines between Kenya and Ethiopia just open up with very similar questions that we often overlook the vested interest around transmission sector, which could be stronger and more important and influential. And we should discuss more about this, I think. And the third question is about, I'm sorry, critical issue of overall the social injustice that we talk about related to climate is so deeply entrenched of our global political economy system, our national political economy system. Are we wagging the tail to the dog? How to fix that? It's like if we can't find solutions for fundamental changes at global system or national system, it's unlikely that all these deeply embedded injustices can be addressed. It's even beyond the division between democratic and non-democratic countries. It's like all countries, like all systems, face these injustices at all levels, and it's exacerbating. I mean, in the Western countries, it's the same thing. Like we will face millions of people coming back into energy poverty under the UN definition that 5% or 10% of monthly income will be spending on energy bills. So it's totally, but how to fix this? How to even think conceptualizing these challenges? I think I would like to endorse that. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Could we take a couple more questions and then we can kind of distribute it to the panelists? Yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Nataron. I'm from Cambodia Energy Lab. So we have been talking about transformation and also transition. And the first speaker was sharing the role of China in its leadership. And there were a very famous battle at WTO level between China and the US at a time when the solar panel were not that much developed, and China was known for subsidizing heavily its panel industry using step subsidies, and therefore the US accusing China of dumping to capture US markets. So this is the introduction, because it's interesting to see also that different countries invest differently in the RE tech, but the RE tech is going to support the transformation of the energy industry in the region. So my question is there other alternatives? It's a bit of a provocative question to the whole panel. Is there other alternatives to China in order to supply the energy transition in ASEAN region and beyond? What are the role of other developed economy, which have also advanced technology systems, such as South Korea, Japan, but also in Asia Pacific, other countries that have championed the energy transition, such as Australia. Some of the states are 100% VRE, variable renewable energy today. So how do you see the distribution of the role among all those actors in the region? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can do one more question and then go to the panelists. And if there's time, we can do another round of questions. How is that sound? John, yes, John, sorry.
Yeah, John Dorr, work at the Australian Embassy here in Bangkok. So thanks to all the speakers. So just a quick one. Following the colleague behind me, I'm interested in Sam or others' response, not just to carbon pricing and carbon markets, but carbon accounting and offsets. I know in my country, we're having, quite a trouble at the moment, just sort of looking at the integrity of the accounting. So just curious, any reflections you have on global improvements in that area. Secondly, perhaps to Sunil online, it's another thing about integrity of data, if you like. I'm curious as to Sunil's view on the the integrity of the cost estimates that are put forward. His final slide, or second to last slide, was talking about improving the methodology of these estimates. You know, and where I'm coming from, I suppose, is that people spend money in households or countries in very different ways. You know, my grandmother would spend $1,000 far more efficiently than you know, a program manager at some less impacted sort of zone. So I'm curious about the integrity of the numbers and what his ideas are for improving. And then finally, really, it's one to Joydeep, if you wish. And you know, you're talking about sort of concerns with the Westphalian state and whatever else, and track 1 processes. We also have track 2 processes, and then something in between. Interested in how the reportage of those different tracks can sort of, you know, so your profession, how you can sort of find a way to sort of report equally, if that's the right word, the different perspectives that come through. And then, of course, wondering about the value of the track 1.5 there in your own country. For example, what is Samir Saran's sort of annual event? What's it called? I can't remember. You know, yes, you know, just sort of curious about your view on the utility of events like that, processes like that, and whether or not it could be of value for others of us in different places. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. In the interest of being polite to the online people, could I jump to Sunil first, and then Jeannie, and then we can come to Sam and Joydeep. And panelists, feel free to choose to reflect on any of these questions, but of course, anything that is directly directed at you, please respond.
Thank you. So, so I'll start with that question on costing of needs. Yeah, you know, we've seen, and given how complex the climate crisis is, and how complex it is to deal with the crisis, both in terms of you know, mitigating the climate change, and also being able to adapt and also deal with or address loss and damage. It's an emerging, you know, area of research. So what we've seen so far is that many countries, though they have been, you know, asked to provide the estimate of what is required in terms of the nationally determined contributions, there is this vehicle in the UN climate system which asks countries to provide an estimate of what is required to deal with the crisis. So the nationally determined contributions primarily looks into the mitigation side of things. That's how it was agreed. But again, some of the countries have, you know, chosen to also, you know, provide the estimate in terms of what is required to deal with the adaptation. So what we've seen is like, you know, there are some global estimates which, you know, come from various sources which try to make the global estimates. And then there are you know, efforts to make estimates at the national level, looking into, you know, different sectors, looking into different, you know, areas of needs that is being prioritized based on their national circumstances. But what we've seen is that it is a very difficult task. Is our report pointed out that many countries chose not to provide that estimate because it's, you know, they don't know how to make that estimate credible. So that is one of the reasons we said that, you know, the developing countries, particularly which are not being able to provide that estimate, will require support to be able to do that. And, you know, there are different methodologies that are being developed. And we also see that, you know, you know, there is no denying that the cost of the crisis are escalating day by day because of lack of that, you know, effort. And what we have to start by is looking at the estimates that have come up is the floor, you know, the bare minimum that the climate crisis is causing, rather than the robust estimates of what is required. So I'd, you know, I'd stop at that, but again, I emphasize that we'll require much more efforts to make, you know, credible estimates, especially, you know, with this loss and damage funding now being, you know, agreed. Countries will again have to, you know, do that exercise of how they can come up with those estimates. But the fact that, you know, there is a very acute lack of support that is being delivered is something we need to highlight. We will not come up with 100% exact estimate, but we know that there is a huge need, and there is a huge need to scale up the support. And then again, coming up with how we approach this transition, how we go forward, is something we need to also be looking into, because what we've discussed is that we talk about this climate crisis, we talk about other different crises that the world is grappling with. The poly crisis is the terminology that has been coming up, but we've not mentioned the elephant in the room, the dominant economic model, the capitalism which is driving these multiple crises. We need to tackle that head on. Unless and until we do that, then we are like, just making incremental changes, and which will not result into the transformation that is required. Because we've seen that is, some of the colleagues in the panel also mentioned out that, it is the system which is driving this inequality, the social inequality, the climate inequality. We've seen that a few hundred billionaires contribute to this, crisis a million times more than an average person. We know that, but we've not been doing anything. We've not been doing anything to, tackle that. We've also seen that it's not about changing one, mode of technology to another. It's not about changing from, coal to solar, for example. It's about the way the economy, functions should be, transformed. We need to be able to do that, because we've seen that despite a huge, progress on deployment of renewable energy, we've not seen that is not replacing the fossil fuel. Fossil fuels. It's only adding to the energy mix. It's not, replacing the fossil fuels that need to be stopped. We've seen that. So we need to talk. We need to be thinking from that broader perspective of what is the alternative. We need to start thinking about the alternative economic models. Here in Oxfam, we talk about human economy. Several, countries, several nations, and several communities are piloting or already implementing an alternative mode of, the well-being, alternative mode of running the economies at, national or at community level. We need to scale up, or we need to promote the solutions which not only look for the profits of the few, but also deliver the well-being for the many. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sunil. Ginny, any brief reflections, especially on the question of vested interests in the transmission? It would be relevant to what you were talking about earlier.
Yes, I think there are plans already to have the transmission lines, but it's interesting to see it slowly happen. But I think Joydeep's comment on climate injustice is also really interesting, because similar to India, Thailand is also a highly unequal country. So most of the time when environmental reporting, the poor are either the most affected, but then they don't have the say, or then they also contribute to issues like plastic pollution, but that's also linked to how their living conditions are. So yeah, climate injustice within a country, I think, is also important. Yeah.
Thank you, Ginny. Coming back to Sam, seems to be quite a few elephants in the room, a whole herd, in fact.
Thanks. I'll try to rattle through a few of these big questions. So Wei asked an important question about the role of carbon markets in China. So yeah, starting with the carbon credits scheme, the emissions trading system, as opposed to voluntary tradable assets. There is quite a lot happening. I mean, it took a long time to get off the ground, the carbon trading market. It was delayed and delayed again, and was one of these things that sort of seemed to be held up in part by the transfer, as I understand it, the transfer of responsibility for carbon and for climate policy used to sit under the main economic planner that also controls energy policy. The National Development Reform Commission moved across to the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. I think now, following the reshuffle after the 20th Party Congress, it may now shift back to the NDRC. So I don't know if that's going to present further challenges. But in any case, it finally got up and running last year, covers only the power sector. In theory, that's that's quite small compared to some of the sectors it could cover. But then that also is what, 12% of global carbon emissions. So it's actually, I mean, huge coverage. And yet it's still at quite an incipient kind of stage, and not highly developed, not highly costly for companies. You know, it's been developed in theory, sort of on the basis that something like the EU ETS is, you know, how it's designed. However, the advantage that the EU ETS has today is that it's quite transparent, and we understand really where the allocations are moving and what the overall kind of targets are. And so, you know, we have quite a good idea of how carbon should be priced, you know, in 2030, whatever, according to the EU ETS. Of course, there's you know, it's a market system, and yet we know what the allocations will be. We broadly know sort of where it's going. With China, I think the problem is that it's still very opaque as to where it's heading, what the allocations are going to look like. However, there's also plans around its expansion to beyond the power sector. So there should be the inclusion of a few more sectors, probably petrochemicals, some of these other, you know, big industrial kind of, you know, maybe steel, aluminium, and so on. But again, there's a real opacity about which sectors are going to be included. So it's all to say, you know, yes, it's progressing, but at the moment, it's not got a lot of teeth, and largely that's because it's still quite opaque, and as a result, isn't sending very important market signals. I would say, you know, in contrast to what I was talking about earlier around just the overall big targets, particularly the quote unquote dual carbon goals, and the way those are fleshing out some actually pretty significant industrial decarbonization plans and so on, in a quite top-down fashion. Those are really sending a signal. You know, I really think if you work in any of those sectors, steel or aluminium, whatever, you realize quite quickly actually that you're going to need to decarbonize, and that there's going to be quite serious sort of top-down targets placed on your sector. And it's probably, I think, applying a lot more pressure than the ETS is at the moment, is my impression. Carbon accounting and offsets market is difficult. It is being used widely in China, including as compensation for ecological damage. So you know, in courts around the country where companies or local governments are being fined for illegal logging, they're now paying that off through compensation paid off in tradable offsets. Now, what the integrity of those offsets are, good question, and it's unclear, you know, with those payments really sort of what they are. Same for some there was an illegal sand mining case. And again, the compensation was paid through marine carbon credits, but you know, the integrity of those credits, I mean, you know, it's a bigger question about what the integrity of these credits is, but, you know, very broadly speaking, I understand the way a national emissions trading system works. And as I say, I think, you know, the EU system isn't perfect, but it is kind of transparent and fairly predictable. These sorts of voluntary schemes, I think, are much more tricky, particularly when it comes to the nature-based offsets. You know, tree planting is a particularly difficult one in a context of climate change, where some of those assets will be wiped out by forest fires, as is already happening in the US. You need to include a big buffer to account for that. There's also the fact that these are I don't understand how these are remotely fungible kind of assets because of the variance in quality across these different assets. So you've got, you know, you've got different vintages, different times, different systems, and then of course when it you know, different accounting sort of systems and standards. And then when it comes to the nature-based assets, there's a lot beyond carbon that you should be including in you know, in terms of soils or different, you know, diversity of crops, all kinds of different things. How do you create a remotely kind of fungible asset? I think it's still a very strange market, and I don't understand how it can ever really be transparent and liquid. At the moment, it certainly isn't. So I find it quite worrying that it has grown in China so fast, in part in order to offset for environmental damage that's actually been recorded and violations. So an interesting one to watch. Yeah, transmission infrastructure, China's state grids monopoly has has been really advantaged by the Belt and Road Initiative. When you look at some of the biggest projects overseas over the last several years, many of them have been ultra high voltage transmission that China talks about as a big part of its sort of offer to the world in terms of thinking about, you know, interconnected renewables, smart grid systems, and so on. And I think, you know, it's interesting, and actually it's something that plays into this, just to sort of link it back to this other theme that people have been coming back to, which is around the sort of inequality within countries. If you look at the overall planning for China's own power systems over the last few years, there's a big emphasis on a new form of spatial planning, geographic spatial planning, that sees Western China as the resource for not only renewables, but also for the quote unquote clean and efficient generation of coal power. So in, you know, much of Western China, poorer areas, these are seen broadly as the resource and as the places to extract energy, whether it's renewables or coal. And then this will be transported to affluent demand centers in the east through ultra high voltage transmission lines. And that's, broadly speaking, the whole sort of geography of energy that's now playing out. And, you know, this has been talked about critically by Chinese academics and even officials in an earlier era. Pan Yue, famous environmental official, back in 2007, wrote a piece for China Dialogue, and the title was "The Rich Consume and the Poor Suffer the Pollution." You know, writing about China, you know, with an understanding that exactly as, you know, what plays out internationally in terms of the, you know, the pollution haven hypothesis, where, you know, countries with tighter regulation export their pollution to areas with more lax regulation, saying that, you know, this actually happens within China, and of course it does, and you know, that's clearly a phenomenon. Final point on about, I think others can talk about it more, probably from Natarin's very smart point about the geography of solar PV production and how this changes. Yes, I think in an increasingly bifurcated world with a decoupling of supply chains, we're going to see greater competition between countries to be the sort of leading suppliers of low carbon technologies. You know, that's not necessarily a bad thing, actually, if it leads to healthy competition and a sort of race to the top. My worry is that it doesn't, and it actually just makes it far more difficult to get to where we need to go. I would say that what was interesting about that moment, that of the US and the EU putting anti-dumping kind of regulations, anti-dumping actions that led to a curtailment of export opportunities for China, is that it led to China beefing up its own domestic market in response. And that's actually what led to many of the cost reductions. I mean, I would say the enormous sort of cost reductions that's really benefited, you know, the global markets for solar really only came about after that aggressive attempt to create a domestic market, which led to, you know, economies of scale and competition between large state firms in China, and ended up sort of having this spillover effect that was effectively a sort of global public good. But it was through this strange kind of dialectic, really, where China was actually closed off from a lot of export markets, and had to create that. So it ended up in the place we are now.
Just before we go to Joydeep, there was another interesting question about the alternative to China. Can other regional economies take up a leadership role? Could you speak to that? I mean, you don't have to, but
my impression is that no one is really able to compete on cost as it stands. Maybe on the more advanced, you know, maybe on the more advanced technologies, other countries will be able to steal a march. The US, Israel, other countries that have been really investing in some of the high tech. But I think in terms of cost innovation thus far, Chinese companies are consistently in the, you know, top 4 or 5 solar PV firms because of their advantages on cost. But that maybe that won't be the case forever, and this sort of decoupling and so on might create advantages for other countries.
Excellent, thanks. Over to you, Joydeep. We're running a little late, but that's okay, right?
Right, I know we are running late. I can see that. So yes, so I think instead of talking about what my fellow panelists have already talked about, I'll try at least to start with, unless there are other demands, answer two questions. The first is John's question on how to move track 2 to track 1.5 to track 1. My answer is that to start with track 3, not even track 2. And what I define track 3 as academics and journalists actually bringing it to the notice of people who are in track 2, which is this other civil society, NGOs, and then they take it up. And then it comes to 1.5 and then to 1. I completely agree that as things stand today, it would be naive and utopian to say that you can do away with sovereign nation states. You cannot. They have to talk. But you have to create a situation for any of this to be anything more than a zero-sum game. You have to create a bottom-up demand for it to be a more than a zero-sum game. Otherwise, diplomats, there are many of us who know diplomats, some of us are diplomats, are trained to negotiate, to give the least and take the most. That's what their training is. And so in that way, you cannot solve a transboundary problem. You can, at best, in a river, you can apportion water. That's the best case scenario. But how you cannot apportion air? You cannot apportion the carbon dioxide in the air. So it doesn't work in the traditional negotiating sense of a WTO. It has to work in a way where the negotiators themselves see a larger interest beyond the interest of their sovereign state, however they define. I'm not going into that at all, how the government defines the interest of the country. But anyway it defines it, even in the best case scenario, will not solve the problem. Will not solve the problem unless they're able to see, negotiators are able to see beyond the interests of their state alone. And that for that to happen, I think it's absolutely essential to have a groundswell of opinion. We have seen this. We have seen this, the maximum push for global climate action, joint climate action, have come from countries where there has been a lot of public demand for it. Even today, that continues. And so that's why I say it's very important for media and academia to actually report on what's happening on the ground, bring that to track 2, where civil society takes it up, and civil society, subnational governments, I'm thinking very specially of city governments, and they take it up. Then it goes to track 1.5, where government and non-government people meet, and then it goes between governments. Yes, I completely think that that's a must. I'm going to move to Dr. Vaishan's overall injustice question. I mean, this, of course, is a very difficult question for me to answer. In fact, it's for you people to answer. But whatever little I know tells me that if Adam Smith was writing The Wealth of Nations today, his factors of production would not only be land, labor, and capital, it would include water and air. He did not include it because they were not limiting factors of production when he was writing. And if you think of that, if you think of it from that economic point of view, I think at least theoretically, you'll be able to figure out a lot of what's going on. And there have been lots of very good economists who have looked at it very carefully and come up with models. I mean, I can name Amartya Sen, Eleanor Rostrom, Piketty, lots of others. So there are models available which reduce injustice. I do not know of any government which is today willing to go that route. I do know that even the World Bank tried green accounting with two model countries, India and Peru. Both did it and both dumped it. Sorry, India and Costa Rica. Both did it. India completely dumped it immediately. Costa Rica tried for a while and then dumped it. So I don't know how to solve that. But again, that's something for which you need a lot of demand from the citizens. For governments to move beyond business as usual, to move beyond the lobbies, which capture all governments of all kinds, of all hues, and move to a more alternate situation. I'll just say one more thing, because I do want to say this, that look, work on climate actually needs to happen at two levels. One is what we have been talking about, which is climate justice. And that's very important, to talk about climate justice, to demand climate justice, to discuss climate justice. But there is the other level. Don't hold your breath waiting for climate justice to happen. If you do that, then the impacts, which are already biting, are just going to get worse. So action, domestic action at the government level, subnational government level, individual household level is a must without waiting for climate justice. We all know what those actions are. They are possible. I'll not go into details because we're running late. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's quite an appropriate way to end on the need for climate action. So once again, let me thank especially the two speakers online, Jeannie and Sunil, and our two speakers here in the room. Thank you very much for a fascinating session, and over to you, Carl, for any housekeeping.
Thank you so much also to Rajesh for moderating a very interesting session. Thank you. So we are a little bit behind, but fortunately lunch is just outside the door. So we'll go and eat, I think, and maybe I'm going to try and nudge you back into the room at about 1:15. I don't know if you're going to let me or not. It's about half an hour to have lunch, but if you're enjoying your conversations, we'll be a bit more flexible, but we'll shorten lunch all the same. Okay, so have a nice lunch, please.